My flight back from a week-long business trip was scheduled for the next morning, but a storm grounded every plane in the city. The airline offered me a hotel voucher. I declined. I wanted to be home, in my own bed, next to my wife. We'd been married for 7 years, and though things had felt off lately, I thought it was just the stress of work, bills, and life. The drive from the airport was quiet, rain tapping against the windshield, streetlights blurring in the downpour. I smiled, picturing her surprise when she'd see me walk through the door earlier than expected. Maybe we'd order takeout, open a bottle of wine, and talk the way we used to. I didn't even call to tell her I was coming. I wanted the moment to be spontaneous. When I stepped inside, the house was dimly lit. Her car was in the driveway, but the living room was empty. No TV on, no music, just silence, except for faint noises coming from upstairs. I remember feeling a strange tension in my chest as I climbed the stairs, each creak of the wood echoing in my ears. The bedroom door was slightly open. Light spilled out in a thin line across the hallway carpet. I pushed it open, and there they were. My wife, sitting up in bed, the sheet tangled around her, eyes wide. Beside her, in nothing but boxers, was my best friend, the man I'd known since we were kids, the man who was my best man at the wedding. For a second, none of us moved. Then she clutched the blanket to her chest, stammering, "It's not what it looks like." He just stared at me, pale, frozen, like he'd seen a ghost. I didn't yell, I didn't throw a punch, I just looked at them both and said 5 words. "I'll let you both finish." And then I walked out. I could feel their eyes on my back as I descended the stairs, my footsteps steady. I grabbed my suitcase, stepped out into the rain, and got in my car. My heart wasn't racing, my hands weren't shaking. Instead, there was a cold clarity settling over me, like ice filling my veins. I didn't drive to a friend's house. I didn't check into a hotel. I drove to my office, sat at my desk, opened my laptop. They thought I'd gone to lick my wounds. They thought I'd cry, maybe even beg for answers. But I'd already started thinking about the one thing they weren't prepared for, a plan. A plan that wouldn't just end our marriage or our friendship, it would strip them of everything they valued, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to take. And when that day came, they would understand exactly what it feels like to lose everything. By the time they realized what I'd done, it was already too late. Before that night, if you had asked me to name the 2 people I trusted most in the world, I would have said my wife, Claire, and my best friend, Mark. Without hesitation, they weren't just part of my life. They were woven into every single piece of it. I'd known Mark since we were 10 years old. We met playing pickup basketball in the cracked court behind our school. He was the kind of guy who could charm anyone. Teachers, girls, even parents who were usually suspicious of every teenager. He had a quick smile, a quick temper, and a knack for getting into trouble. But no matter what, we had each other's backs. Through high school fights, failed classes, and first heartbreaks, we were inseparable. Claire came into my life a decade later. I was 28. Working long hours to prove myself in my field, when I met her at a friend's dinner party. She had this laugh that drew every head in the room, and a way of talking to you that made you feel like you were the only person there. We started dating almost immediately. Within a year we were married. Mark was my best man. He stood next to me at the altar, made a speech that had everyone laughing and tearing up, and toasted to a friendship and a love that would last forever. I believed every word. In the early years everything seemed solid. Claire and I had our routines. Sunday morning coffee at the little cafe 2 blocks away, movie nights with cheap wine. I'd go to the gym with Mark, then we'd meet Claire for dinner. We were a trio that just worked. But looking back, I can see the cracks forming long before they shattered. It started small, a missed call from Claire when she said she'd be home. A strange pause in a conversation when I walked into a room, Mark cancelling our gym sessions more often. I told myself it was just life. People get busy, schedules change. Then, there were the little comments. Claire mentioning how funny Mark was. Mark teasing me about how I worked too much, saying, "Don't let me steal your wife while you're at the office." He'd say it with a laugh, and I'd laugh too, because who would take that seriously? But the distance between Claire and me grew. Arguments about nothing, where to eat, how to spend the weekend, turned into longer silences. She started going out with friends from work more often. Mark somehow always seemed to know where she'd been. I ignored the signs, not because I was blind, but because the alternative that the 2 people I trusted most were betraying me was unthinkable. You don't burn the foundation of your life unless you're sure it's already rotten. And then came the business trip. I'd been sent out of town to meet with potential clients. It wasn't unusual for me to be gone for days at a time. I kissed Claire goodbye, told Mark I'd catch up when I got back, and left without a single suspicion. 7 days later, my flight got cancelled, and I decided to surprise her. The moment I opened that bedroom door, every memory, every laugh, every shared secret between the three of us twisted into something ugly. And yet, as I stood there, I realized something important. They had planned their betrayal in the shadows, but I had the advantage now. Because I had seen them, and they didn't yet know what I was going to do with that knowledge. I didn't go home that night. After leaving them in that bedroom, I drove straight to my office. It was almost midnight when I got there, the building dark except for the glow of the security lights in the parking lot. I sat in my car for a while, rain drumming on the roof, my hands resting on the steering wheel. There was a part of me that wanted to storm back into that house, throw their clothes out into the street, demand answers, scream until my throat was raw. That would have been the natural reaction, the human reaction. But I'd learned a long time ago, both in work and in life, that the first strike often decides the war, and I wasn't going to waste mine on a screaming match that gave them time to prepare. So I stayed quiet. I let myself replay every detail of what I'd seen, not to torture myself, but to burn it into my memory. The way Claire's eyes had widened, the way Mark's jaw had tightened when he saw me, the sudden silence that told me they'd been laughing only moments before. I opened my laptop and began making a list, not of things to take from them, but of everything they valued. People, places, assets, relationships, connections. I knew both of them better than they knew themselves, and I knew exactly where their weak spots were. Mark had been coasting for years, relying on charm and connections to keep himself afloat. His savings were minimal. He lived for the next party, the next expensive dinner, the next photo that made him look successful. But most of all, he relied on me. I'd been his safety net since we were kids. I'd gotten him jobs, vouched for him when he screwed up, introduced him to people who could open doors. Without me, those doors would close. Claire. Hers was a different kind of weakness. She loved appearances, social circles, the charity events where she could wear a new dress and pretend she belonged among old money. She'd grown up middle class, but in our marriage, she'd gotten used to the taste of something more. I was the one who'd given her that. In the quiet hours of that night, I realized something simple but powerful. They'd built parts of their lives on the foundation I had laid for them. If I pulled it away, they wouldn't just fall, they'd crumble. But to do that, I couldn't act like a man whose world had been shattered. I had to act normal. I had to let them believe I was hurt, broken, and maybe even willing to forgive. If they thought I was planning something, they'd run, they'd hide, they'd prepare. So I sent Claire a single text. Flight got delayed, staying at the office tonight. We'll talk tomorrow. The lie would buy me time. The next morning, I walked into the house as if nothing had happened. Claire was in the kitchen, making coffee, acting like we were living any other day. Her eyes flicked up to mine, searching for some sign of what I knew. I gave her nothing, just a tired smile and a morning. Mark didn't show up for 2 days. When he did, it was at a bar we both frequented. He greeted me with forced casualness, his laugh too loud, his eyes too cautious. I played along, bought him a drink, asked about his week. Every word I spoke, every look I gave, was part of something bigger. They thought they'd gotten away with it. They thought I was pretending nothing happened because I was afraid to face it. But I wasn't pretending, I was preparing. And by the time they realized that, there would be nothing left for them to hold on to. In the weeks that followed, I became a ghost in my own life, present enough to be seen, but never revealing what I was thinking. Claire and I spoke in polite tones, the kind couples use when they're trying to avoid a fight in public. We shared meals, exchanged small talk, and slept in the same bed, though miles apart in silence. Mark slipped back into my orbit slowly, like a stray dog testing whether it's safe to approach. We met for drinks twice, just like we used to, talking about sports and work as if nothing had happened. If either of them noticed the absence of emotion in my voice, they didn't say a word.
I was counting on that.
The first step wasn't to confront them, it was to isolate them. Not physically, but socially, financially, emotionally. I needed to remove the safety nets they didn't even realize they had. With Mark, it started with a few quiet conversations in the right places. I knew people who hired based on reputation, who trusted my word. A subtle comment here, he's been going through some personal issues there, and doors began to close for him. Nothing dramatic, nothing traceable, just opportunities disappearing. He thought it was bad luck. He even complained to me about it one night over beers. I nodded sympathetically, told him these things happen, and bought the next round. Claire's world was different. Hers wasn't built on a career, it was built on perception, and perception is fragile. I began to quietly distance myself from her social circles, the ones I had introduced her to. When invitations came for dinners or charity events, I attended alone, explaining with a polite smile that Claire wasn't feeling well or was visiting family. At first it was subtle, but in those circles, absence is noticed. Whispers start, people speculate, and in her world, speculation is poison. Meanwhile, I was preparing something bigger, something neither of them could see coming. I went through our finances, not in a panic, but with precision. Every account, every investment, every shared asset. I moved things slowly, methodically, making sure everything important was in my name or in places Claire couldn't touch without me. Legally, I was still her husband. That gave me more control than she realized. The key was patience. I didn't need to destroy them in a week. I wanted the collapse to be slow enough that they didn't realize it was connected to me until they were standing in the rubble. One night, about a month after that night, Claire came into the living room while I was reading. She stood there for a moment, watching me, then asked, "Are we okay?" Her voice was tentative, like she was afraid of the answer. I looked up, smiled faintly, and said, "We will be." It wasn't a lie. We would be okay, just not together, and not in the way she imagined. Mark, on the other hand, didn't ask questions, but I could see the unease in him growing. He laughed less, drank more, checked his phone constantly, like he was waiting for bad news to arrive. What neither of them knew was that bad news had already begun its journey toward them, and I was the one sending it. By the time they realized they were in trouble, it would already be far too late to climb out. It started small. That's how you break someone without them realizing you're holding the hammer. You tap, not strike. Tap hard enough, long enough, and eventually the surface gives way. With Mark, the first crack came in the form of a phone call. We were at a bar one evening, mid-conversation, when his phone lit up with the name of a company we both knew well. He excused himself to take it. When he came back, he looked pale. "They decided to go in a different direction," he said, forcing a shrug. "That's tough," I replied, sipping my drink. "Something better will come along." He didn't know that the different direction was away from him because of a conversation I'd had a week earlier. Nothing overt, just a subtle, "I'm not sure he's in the right headspace for something that demanding right now." People hear that from someone they trust, and they start to think twice. Claire's cracks appeared in a different way. One Saturday afternoon, we were supposed to attend a garden party hosted by one of her favorite couples in the social circuit. She'd been talking about it for weeks, but 2 days before I got a call from the host. I told her very politely that Claire was feeling under the weather and might not make the best company. The invitation was postponed for her. Claire was furious when she found out I was still going. "Why didn't you just stay home with me?" she asked. "I didn't want to waste the ticket," I said, keeping my tone light. "You understand." It happened again with another event, and another. Each time I made sure she was aware of the gathering pictures, casual mentions, but never in a way that made her suspect my involvement. In her mind, it was bad luck. In reality, I was eroding her standing, one absence at a time. Meanwhile, I continued securing our finances. A joint investment account she'd occasionally used for personal spending, closed, with funds redirected. A savings account she didn't check often, emptied into an account only I could access. I did it all quietly, with paperwork in perfect order, so if she ever tried to challenge it, there would be nothing to grab onto. Mark began drinking more heavily. He complained to me about money, something he'd never done before. "It's like everything's drying up at once," he said. "Yeah," I replied sympathetically. "It's been a rough season for everyone." Claire became restless. She spent more time on her phone, pacing the kitchen, sighing loudly when she thought I wasn't looking. She started picking small fights with me, about the dishes, about laundry, about nothing. I let her. Every argument was just another sign that the pressure was working. I didn't need them to suspect me. I needed them to suspect everything else. That's how you keep your enemy looking in the wrong direction while you dismantle their foundation. One evening I came home late from work and found Claire sitting in the dark, a half-empty glass of wine in her hand. "Do you even care anymore?" she asked. I walked past her to the kitchen, poured myself a drink, and said, "More than you know." She didn't realize that I wasn't talking about our marriage. I was talking about the plan, and we were only just getting started. By the 3rd month, the subtle cracks I'd been chiseling into their lives began to widen into fractures. It was time to turn the screws, just enough that they could feel the walls starting to close in, but still not enough to trace it back to me. Mark was my first target. He'd been trying to land a contract with a mid-sized company, one that would have given him steady income for at least a year. He'd been talking about it non-stop, convinced it was his way back on his feet. I made a single phone call to someone on the board I'd worked with in the past. All it took was a calm, "you might want to double-check his references," and a quiet implication that he'd been unreliable lately. 2 days later, the deal fell through. I was there when he got the news. We were sitting at the bar, his phone buzzing in his hand. He stared at the screen, jaw tightening, then muttered, "Unbelievable, that was mine." I put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Bad timing, I guess." I don't think he realized I was almost smiling. Claire's world was even easier to dismantle. Her place in the social hierarchy depended on flawless appearances, so I started feeding her bad information, telling her an event was casual when it was formal, or vice versa. A cocktail dress at a garden luncheon, flats at a black tie fundraiser. Each time she'd paste on a smile, pretending it didn't matter, but I saw the flicker in her eyes when someone would glance at her outfit a little too long. Those moments eat away at a person like her. The embarrassment wasn't enough to ruin her reputation, but it planted seeds of doubt in the minds of people she desperately wanted to impress. Behind the scenes, I kept tightening financial control. I made a large legitimate transfer to an account Claire didn't know existed, using the pretense of a business investment. In reality, it was insulation, money she would never be able to touch if she tried to make a move. Every bill, every expense ran through me. If she wanted something, she had to ask. She hated that, but she didn't confront me, not yet. The more they stumbled, the more I played the role of the sympathetic friend and husband. I was there to listen when Mark complained about being cursed. I was the steady, quiet presence when Claire lamented how things used to be better. I nodded, offered small comforts, and never once let them see the satisfaction beneath the surface. Then came the first real sign that they were starting to feel the pressure. One evening, I caught Mark watching me across the bar, a frown creasing his face. Not the casual glance of a friend, but the calculating stare of someone trying to figure you out. Claire, meanwhile, had started texting him more often, their little glances at each other sharper, more defensive, whenever we all happened to be in the same room. Good. Let them turn to each other. Let them think the problem was the outside world, or bad luck, or even the strain of keeping their secret from me. Because the truth was, the noose was already around their necks, and I was just deciding how quickly to pull it tight. It was around the 4th month when their luck finally started to look less like bad fortune and more like a curse they couldn't shake. The cracks I'd carved into their foundations had spread so far that neither of them could hide it anymore. Mark called me one morning, his voice tight. "You busy?" "Not really," I said. "Good. I need a loan. Just a small one. I've got something lined up, but I'm short until it closes." The old me, the friend who'd bailed him out a dozen times, would have wired the money without a second thought. This time, I let a pause stretch just long enough for him to feel it. "Sorry, Mark, things are tight right now too." He went quiet for a moment before forcing a laugh. Yeah, no worries, just thought I'd ask," but I could hear the crack in his voice. For the first time since we were kids, he'd reached for my hand, and I'd let him fall. Claire's unraveling was less direct, but no less satisfying. She'd been left off the guest list for a gala she'd attended every year since we married. She confronted one of the organizers about it in front of half the committee. The woman just smiled and said, "We assumed you were no longer involved in those circles." That night, Claire came home furious, slamming doors, muttering under her breath. I stayed in the living room, sipping whiskey, pretending to read. She didn't speak to me for 2 days. Financially, they were both starting to choke. Mark had drained his savings, sold his watch collection, and was quietly trying to sublet his apartment to cover debts. Claire had begun making little comments about the cost of groceries, the electric bill, the wine she used to buy without thinking. Every expense was a reminder that she wasn't in control anymore, and I made sure that control stayed firmly in my hands. Then came the moment I knew the end game was close. I came home early one evening to find them both in the kitchen. Mark was leaning against the counter, Claire sitting at the island, their voices low and urgent. They stopped talking the instant they saw me. "What's going on?" I asked casually. "Nothing," Claire said too quickly. "Just catching up," Mark added, his tone flat. I nodded, walked to the fridge, and grabbed a beer. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The air in the room felt thick, almost electric. They were scared. They didn't know of what exactly, but they could feel it. Something was closing in on them, and for the first time, they were beginning to suspect it might not be random chance. That night, lying in bed beside Claire, I could hear her breathing unevenly. I knew she was awake. I almost told her then, whispered in the dark, exactly what I'd been doing and how much further I planned to go. But I didn't. Because the most dangerous weapon you can hold over someone is not the act itself, It's the anticipation of it. And I wanted them to live in that space a little longer. By the 5th month, their lives were hanging by threads I could cut whenever I wanted, and I was ready to start cutting. The first thread was Mark's last real source of income, a consulting gig with a mid-level firm he'd managed to land through a friend of a friend. I knew the owner. One phone call, a brief lunch, and a few well-placed facts about issues in his personal life were all it took. Mark showed up at my place that evening, red-eyed and jittery. They just dropped me. No warning, he said, pacing my living room. I leaned back in my chair, watching him. That's rough. Maybe you should take a break for a while. Clear your head. He didn't know he was already halfway to the bottom. Claire's last thread was her social status, the one thing she clung to even as everything else slipped away. She still had a small circle of friends, wealthy, self-important people who liked having her around because she was fun, so I invited those same friends to a dinner party at our house. She didn't know about it until the day of, and when she walked in, ready to play the perfect hostess, I made sure every conversation drifted to topics she couldn't control, business deals she wasn't part of, events she hadn't been invited to, vacations she couldn't afford. She smiled through it all, but I saw her hand tremble when she refilled her wine glass. Financially, I was tightening the noose. I'd sold one of our shared assets under the guise of simplifying things, and moved the cash somewhere untouchable. Claire didn't ask where the money went. Maybe she was afraid of the answer. Mark, on the other hand, tried to borrow from me again. This time, I didn't even pretend to hesitate. No, I said flatly. He stared at me, trying to read my face. What the hell's going on with you? I shrugged. Maybe you should ask yourself that. It was around then that they finally started turning on each other. Claire accused Mark of using her for money. Mark accused Claire of ruining his chances with potential clients by making scenes in public. They fought in whispers when they thought I couldn't hear, but I always heard. The beauty of it was that I didn't need to say a word. Every move I'd made had pushed them closer to this distrust, resentment, desperation. They were too busy clawing at each other to realize they were standing in a trap I'd built. One night, I walked past the guest room and saw Mark sleeping there. Claire was in our bed alone. She caught my eye as I paused in the doorway. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, I thought she might break, spill everything, confess, beg. But she didn't, and neither did I. I went to bed that night, knowing the final step was coming. There was only one thing left to take from them, the illusion that they had any control left at all. And when that was gone, there'd be nothing left but the truth. It was around the 4th month when their luck finally started to look less like bad fortune and more like a curse they couldn't shake. The cracks I'd carved into their foundations had spread so far that neither of them could hide it anymore. Mark called me one morning, his voice tight. You busy? Not really, I said. Good, I need a loan. Just a small one. I've got something lined up, but I'm short until it closes. The old me, the friend who'd bailed him out a dozen times, would have wired the money without a second thought. This time, I let a pause stretch just long enough for him to feel it. Sorry, Mark, things are tight right now too. He went quiet for a moment before forcing a laugh. Yeah, no worries, just thought I'd ask, but I could hear the crack in his voice. For the first time since we were kids, he'd reached for my hand, and I'd let him fall. Claire's unraveling was less direct, but no less satisfying. She'd been left off the guest list for a gala she'd attended every year since we married. She confronted one of the organizers about it in front of half the committee. The woman just smiled and said, "We assumed you were no longer involved in those circles." That night, Claire came home furious, slamming doors, muttering under her breath. I stayed in the living room, sipping whiskey, pretending to read. She didn't speak to me for 2 days. Financially, they were both starting to choke. Mark had drained his savings, sold his watch collection, and was quietly trying to sublet his apartment to cover debts. Claire had begun making little comments about the cost of groceries, the electric bill, the wine she used to buy without thinking. Every expense was a reminder that she wasn't in control anymore, and I made sure that control stayed firmly in my hands. Then came the moment I knew the end game was close. I came home early one evening to find them both in the kitchen. Mark was leaning against the counter, Claire sitting at the island, their voices low and urgent. They stopped talking the instant they saw me. "What's going on?" I asked casually. "Nothing," Claire said too quickly. "Just catching up," Mark added, his tone flat. I nodded, walked to the fridge, and grabbed a beer. Neither of them moved, neither of them spoke. The air in the room felt thick, almost electric. They were scared. They didn't know of what exactly, but they could feel it. Something was closing in on them, and for the first time, they were beginning to suspect it might not be random chance. That night, lying in bed beside Claire, I could hear her breathing unevenly. I knew she was awake. I almost told her then, whispered in the dark, exactly what I'd been doing and how much further I planned to go. But I didn't, because the most dangerous weapon you can hold over someone is not the act itself, it's the anticipation of it. And I wanted them to live in that space a little longer.